Good morning. My name is Ben Bingle. I'm the director of the DeKalb County Nonprofit Partnership. I want to thank you all for joining us today for this third webinar in our board governance series. This training focuses on running better board meetings, and that's a topic that we hear time and time again from our members that is relevant and important within their organization. So we're excited to offer this training today. But before we begin, we do have a few housekeeping items. First, we are recording today's webinar. That'll be sent to you later on along with an evaluation form so you can provide your feedback about this training. Like usual, we have everyone muted, but feel free to use the Q&A and chat features that are built into Zoom. We've had some really engaging dialogue at the end of these webinars, and so I want to encourage that again today. We will have around 45 minutes of content today and then allow around 15 minutes for that Q&A and discussion. For those of you who have attended the previous two webinars, you know our presenter well by now. You could probably recite his bio from memory. But for those of you joining for the first time, here's a little bit about his background. Matt Gayer is the co-executive director of the Catalog for Philanthropy in Washington, D.C., which is the region's only locally focused guide to giving and volunteering. They focus on small nonprofits with the goal of creating visibility for these organizations to fuel their growth with philanthropic dollars and to create a movement for social good in the region. Since 2003, the catalog has raised more than $40 million for the network of vetted nonprofits. Before joining the catalog, Matt worked in healthcare consulting. He's a Truman Scholar, holds an MPA, Master of Public Administration degree with a focus in nonprofit management from Syracuse University, and earned a bachelor's in public policy and political science from Southern Methodist University. Matt, welcome, and thanks a lot for joining us again today.
Yeah, thank you all for having me, and excited to dive into this third part of the series today. If you all weren't at the first two, this is totally standalone, but if you were, we've hinted at how important board meetings actually are. So we probably think about board meetings sometimes with a little bit of anxiety if we're an executive director, sometimes with a little bit if not dread, a little bit of ho-hum if I'm a board of directors member, right? It's just kind of a thing I have to go do. We talk a little bit, get out. But we really see board meetings as not just a time to have really important and kind of required strategic conversations, but also a real inflection point for engagement, right? This is the one time that we're getting the board together in person or virtually to actually talk to each other, talk to us, offer opinions, offer advice, have questions asked of them, have tasks given to them. All that happens at our board meetings. So it's really important we see these as opportunities to really drive engagement. If we have some engagement issues currently on our board, one thing we can do is try to structure better meetings, right? All of us have been through bad meetings before, not just board, but in general in life. And we know that how disengaging those can be. So if that's how our board meetings are going currently, even if not bad, but just kind of boring, our board is going to be that much harder to engage. So it's really important we're thinking through these meetings as not just a time to get strategic stuff done, but also as a time to drive that strategic engagement. So similar to some of the other ways we've started these workshops over the last few weeks, just reminding folks how critical board engagement is right now. We're seeing yet again with kind of Delta and COVID spiking, again, a time of uncertainty, a time of a lot of decision making that boards are going to be involved in. So we know there's going to be a lot of planning, back and forth decisions across the rest of the year around fundraising events, programming, staff in office, etc. We know that in general, our board members, right, are volunteers. They have stuff going on in their own life, and this kind of busy news cycle and outside world is going to not necessarily lower their engagement or excitement directly with us, but because they're paying attention to everything else, it makes it harder for them to pay attention to their roles as a board. So it's that much more important we have strategies to engage them. We know a lot of boards and board members haven't met in person since the beginning of all this last March. So if you're in that camp, right, you're looking at, going on almost 16 months 18 months of virtual meetings. That's easy to feel isolated, especially if you're a new board member. We'll talk about some tips to kind of change that dynamic if you're still meeting virtually. And then finally, like I said, with the planning, This is just a time of uncertainty, a time of urgency. So it's really important we have the board we need right now. And one of the ways to drive that engagement for the board is by having these really effective meetings planned. So we'll go through a few tips in general, regardless of the format of your meeting, virtual, in-person, hybrid, etc. And then we'll dive into actually those 3 options for meetings moving forward that we're seeing people choose from. So the first tip we have here is around the agenda itself, right? So this is a really important part of it. The rest of the tips we'll have be around kind of facilitation techniques, things you can do to drive a bit more engagement, right? Drive a bit more connection. But at the heart of it, your agenda really is going to be what decides if your meeting goes well or not in a lot of cases. There's a lot of pitfalls we see to agenda making for board meetings. One of the biggest ones is that we try to do too much during the meeting. So if we try to have every single strategic conversation at the same time, they're all really urgent, they're all really high level. We usually end up either not having enough time for them, right? So it feels rushed, so the board doesn't feel involved, or the meeting goes really long, right? Which is obviously kind of disrespectful of people's time. So it's really important we're making sure we're crafting an agenda we can actually accomplish. And if other conversations have to happen, we'll have to find other times to have them. So a few things here when thinking about in-person or virtual meetings. The first part is around a consent agenda. So if you don't have one of these currently, what this is basically all the kind of very basic votes we have to do, right? We have to approve the minutes from the meeting before. Sometimes this might include approving the financial reports, right? If there's nothing kind of big in there. It could be approving the program report from the executive director. So there's those things that kind of people read, but it's pretty rote to vote on in most cases. We want to package all those together, give to people ahead of time. Sorry, give me 1 second here. Sorry about that, a little feedback. So we're gonna have an early vote on all those items. We're gonna send those ahead of time in the board packet. We'll talk more about the board packet here in a little bit. And we'll make sure that people have a chance to discuss those, asking questions if they have them, but just very quickly vote on those at the beginning so we can move on to more kind of serious and important conversations. The majority of the meeting is going to be these focused conversations, right? So this is really the heart of the meeting and where we'll spend the vast majority of our time together during the board meeting. So this is going to be the majority of the conversation on 1 to 2 key conversations, key points you want to discuss, right? And we'll talk about what those could be here in a second. This allows for a concise meeting, especially if it's happening virtually, but also in person, and also allows the focus and weight on those conversations that they deserve and need. And then finally, if you have other procedural votes, right, approving new candidates, we have to update a committee charter and vote on it. We're updating our bylaws, etc. Doing those at the end of the meeting can be really helpful. This is going to allow us to keep kind of engagement really high in the middle of the meeting, and then also allow for a little bit of engagement early on, a little bit of engagement at the end by actually voting on stuff. An example agenda here, in case that's helpful. Starting at kind of the top of the hour, right, whenever your board meeting begins, you're doing a quick welcome, right, probably from the board chair, if not from the board chair, from the executive director. A mission moment, we'll talk more about what a mission moment can be here in a second. And then a roll call, right, just kind of making sure everyone's there. If you are doing your meeting virtually, actually doing that roll call where people have to say here, even as silly as that sounds, actually drives more engagement. It gets people used to unmuting and participating. In person, you don't always really need to do that. You can obviously just mark people off as you see them, but virtually, we actually do recommend doing an out loud roll call. And again, gets people more in the habit of unmuting, saying things, and participating. That's going to take about 5 or 10 minutes. Then we're probably starting a couple minutes late, realistically. So about 10 minutes in, right, we're going to go over the consent agenda. It's usually the prior meeting minutes that we need to approve, program report from the executive director, and the financial statements often. We're going to be including this as well. Ask for any questions, usually pretty quick. Probably won't need a full 10 minutes on this, but just in case. And then we'll move into a strategic discussion. So these strategic discussions, again, we'll talk more about in just a second here what they could be, but they will focus on big strategic choices the organization's facing, important things that are coming up like events. And we'll talk more about some other options there as well. So we're going to give anywhere from kind of 15 minutes at a minimum to half an hour at a maximum. So building in about 45 minutes for both of these, dividing them as needed, right? If they're equal weight, different weights, but having these kind of two big conversations in the middle here where we're trying to get actual dialogue with the board. About 65 minutes in, any necessary votes or action steps we're going to do. We then can adjourn to executive session. So this is just where the board meets by themselves without any ex officio members, including the executive director. Usually pretty quick, usually led by the board chair, usually just to talk about how the board is doing and some of its own goals, right? If there needs to be any accountability conversations, or if there's any lingering questions or conversation for the meeting itself. So this is kind of an ideal agenda, right? If we do have some financial questions or more financial concerns at the organization, we might pull that part out of the consent agenda, make the consent agenda a little shorter, make our strategic conversations just a few minutes shorter, and build in 10 to 15 minutes to just talk about finances. That's the one change we see people do to this sometimes. But otherwise, this kind of allows for us an outline of how to flow through the meeting. Our second tip is for that mission moment that we mentioned to start the meeting with, right after the welcome and kind of roll call time. So what we mean by a mission moment here is that we know the best board members and the majority of our board members join because they're passionate about what we do, right? Ultimately, it's a volunteer role. They're there because they care about the organization. They care about the clients and community that we serve. And it's really important we're reminding them of that. Just as we would with any donor, any staff member, volunteer, we want to make sure that they're reminded of the fact that what they do matters. And that's what this mission moment allows us to do a bit. So a few ways this can look. There's a lot of options for kind of what we can do with this mission moment. Usually it kind of boils down to one or two things. Either bringing in some type of impact story from the work. There's a few different ways that can look that we'll talk about here in a second. Or driving a conversation on the board about something mission related. So in terms of kind of getting the client involved, these are going to be things like, for instance, we could share a video, right? Either a live video, have someone join via Zoom, or pre-recorded video of a client or volunteer story. Short and sweet, this whole thing should only be a couple minutes, a few minutes long at most, but that video might be an easy way to get people feeling connected. It could be a testimonial, right? So a written story that people are reading and then discussing at the board meeting, but kind of a similar format to the video, just kind of written instead of video, if that's easier for us to put together. It could be a staff person actually being introduced, right? Board doesn't usually meet program staff, especially. So having program staff come, share kind of an impact story, right? Why they care about the work, answer any questions. It's also fun engagement for the staff, right? Who doesn't usually get to see the board. So that can work on kind of both sides to drive engagement there. So those are kind of the ways we can get the impact story. Obviously, if appropriate, we could have the client come in person if we're having an in-person meeting. That's not always appropriate given our work and or possible if our meetings are virtual. The other side of this mission moments is that we could have the board have a conversation with itself about why they care about the work. So usually at least once a year, we actually advise doing this why one, which is asking the board, hey, tell us why you joined the board in the first place, right? And going around and hearing that from each person can actually be a really powerful experience. You can learn a lot there. If you're a new ED or a new board member, you might be hearing things you didn't expect to hear, right? About how people are connected to it. And that can be really valuable. Another thing to ask, especially right now in the midst of so much urgency and kind of need in the community, asking the board why they think this matters so much today, right? So less about why did you join years ago and more about why are you still active right now. And then finally, we've seen some boards even share around an article, right? A local newspaper article, a national article with some stats in it, have people read that ahead of time and actually have a conversation around it. Again, to ground people in the work, ground people in the why. The goal of all of this, right, is not to hit folks over the head with this, right, or belabor the point, but it's just to briefly remind them that when we're looking at spreadsheets, when we're talking high-level strategy and budgets and, et cetera, All that really high level kind of business stuff we're talking about boils down to actually impacting the real world, right? And what the board does is going to make a difference in the community. And it's really important we're kind of driving that home for them, especially right now, that they might feel even more removed than normal from it. So our third tip here is around those strategic conversations we're having at the board meeting. So this is really focused on how we're creating some dialogue to really engage our board members, right? So what are these kind of strategic conversations that we're having? These are things we really are authentically interested in getting the board's opinion on, right? And I should say they're either things that the board's required to give input on, like the budget, and or things we actually do want input on, right? So it's not always decision making. It could very well be, for instance, right now, hey, we're debating if we should go back to the office or not, right? That might be the executive director's decision to actually make because it's dealing with day-to-day operations and staffing. But it might be something that ED doesn't want to have to make alone, right? So ideally, the relationship between the ED and board is one of kind of thought partnership, right? Two sides of the same leadership coin. So being able to use them to get a sounding board advice, outside opinion on some of these topics can be really helpful. Some of the kind of categories of what these strategic conversations usually fall in programmatically. Obviously, you know, kind of the example I already gave about the reopening, but also if we're thinking about doing something totally new, right? So we do want to make sure in these conversations we're avoiding getting the board too involved in the day-to-day weeds, right? We want to keep them at a governance and strategic level, but it can be helpful if we're thinking about launching something new, right? If we have something that we're on the fence about, if it's mission aligned or not, those will be conversations that are helpful with the board. And ultimately, if we're launching it, we probably need board buy-in anyway, or will need it long-term to keep it in the organization and budgeted and funded. So this can be a helpful thing to have a conversation early on if we're thinking about doing something kind of new or different in the programming space. Obviously, some of these conversations can be of financial nature, right? So it could be looking at how we're doing this year. That's often one, you know, kind of 6 months into the year, if not quarterly, having a strategic conversation about, hey, how are we performing against expectations? Where are we winning more? Where are we, you know, not hitting our goals yet? How do we want to adjust accordingly? Obviously, the budget conversation, at least once a year, is going to be one of these topics to do. And then often throughout the year, we might have a conversation around either, hey, you know, we're thinking ahead about our projections, right? Or we're thinking ahead about our cash flow, and we want to talk about some risk we might be seeing, right? Again, these type of financial conversations are great ones to have in these kind of strategic discussion time. Strategy itself, so either actively doing strategic planning or thinking about starting the process could definitely count here. But for any of us that are in a strategic plan currently, this could be revisiting it, right? It's been 6 months, it's been 2 years, etc. since we made that plan. Let's use this time to dive into a piece of it and see how we're performing, right? That can be an easy way to kind of keep people engaged there with that, kind of keep that strategy top of mind for them as well. Could be a conversation around values, right? Vision, you know, etc. And then finally, for the board itself, right? So our strategic conversation might actually be focused about the board with the board. So it could be about board engagement, board recruitment, right? Board fundraising, but talking strategically about these items. Other things we see come up sometimes that didn't fall directly in one of these buckets. Marketing communications, right? Talking to the board about how we get the name out there, how we get more people aware of the work we do, or events, if we have an event coming up. Again, we can use these conversations to inform, right? So maybe the first 5 minutes or so is us as the ED or a specific member of the board sharing information with the rest of the group. But largely, we want to use this time to have dialogue. The goal of this is that people are talking to us, to each other, and that there's feedback coming in and opinions coming in, not just us kind of telling them a lot of things. You know, one way to kind of think about this, right, is because again, we want to create that conversation between board members. So we might want to think about having like a board member introduce the topic, you know, giving materials and background info ahead of time. and making sure that, there is a little bit of a natural kind of peer-to-peer conversation forming. Ideally, this isn't just me talking board members, but as instead board members talking with each other. Small groups is a great way. We'll talk about this actually in a few of the different formats, but using small groups to drive board member to board member conversation. And then as kind of a forcing function, they're reporting out about it, right? And we see a lot of benefits from that we'll dive into a bit more about how to do that. And then ideally, and we'll also talk about this too in some of the different formats, planting some participation, right? So from, excuse me, from when we're talking about our marketing plan, maybe making sure the board member with marketing experience knows about that ahead of time, and maybe asking them to contribute something early on to the conversation can be an easy way to get some people involved. And then finally, we want these conversations to be focused, right? So we don't want to broadly sit down with the board and say, hey, we want to talk about finances. Who's got questions, right? We want to be a lot more specific than that, right? Really drive the conversation with the questions that we're asking. So I want to make sure we're scoping that for the time allowed, that realistically we can have an engaged conversation, but can also come to an endpoint in 20 minutes and that feel authentic. If a bigger debate is expected, right? So maybe if we're doing budget, for instance, we might only have one discussion. So we don't have to have two. Typically we see people have two because we don't really need to have a full 45-minute deep dive into a topic. But there is something we think is going to take more like that 45-50 minutes to get through. We should just do that one conversation, not try to do too much there. Our role as a facilitator, so either board chair, ED, or the board member who's running this part of the meeting, is really to do just that, to facilitate. So we can definitely offer some input, right? Offer some engagement, but we want to make sure that we're also asking questions throughout and trying to keep the conversation flowing. And then finally, if needed, again, we can target some questions based on people's experience. We'll talk more about how to do this really well a little bit later today, but definitely can try to drive that individual engagement as well if people are being a little slow or reticent to participate. The fourth tip that we have here is around the board packet we send out. So this is something that probably most organizations send some version of, but often can be something we're kind of slapping together, right? Trying to get everything together with it, a couple days beforehand. The best practice here, and again, this is a goal. So if right now you're sending the board packet minutes before the board meeting, set a first goal of a couple days before, right? And then we can always get better. But ideally, we're giving this board packet a week before the board meeting. People aren't always looking at it that early, but it's important that we're giving them that opportunity. So we're sending the board packet about a week ahead of time. Some of the information we're including in there, in addition to the agenda, right? So we want to make sure the agenda is in there so people know what we're going to be talking about so they can prep accordingly and kind of mentally come to the space prepared. The other things we want to make sure that are in that board packet ahead of time, some type of narrative component. So this is in no way trying to give extra work to the executive director or the person prepping this, but some type of kind of short and sweet executive director report that's going to touch on programming, operations, finances, fundraising, just a paragraph or two about each that are going to give some really high level updates, right? So this is something the board can read ahead of time. This means that we don't necessarily need to walk through everything. And the best way to do this is kind of prepping this ahead of time, sending as part of the board packet. The ED then spending just like 2 minutes at the beginning of the meeting, giving the highlights from it, kind of an executive summary, asking for any questions on it, and then voting to kind of approve it along with the rest of the consent agenda. This again just ensures the board knows, hey, here's the big stuff happening, even if it isn't quote unquote strategic. We think it's important, we switch accounting firms, or we think it's important, we're hiring right now. Even though the board may or may not be involved in those actual decisions, it's helpful for them to know things are happening. Also, it's helpful for them to know that, if you're slow to respond to something else, it's because you're hiring 3 staff right now. So it gives them a little bit more insight into what's going on at the organization as well. And again, we can get some questions on it, right? Get a little feedback. But typically this isn't a big thing we spend time on, but this does help people kind of just stay feeling informed and engaged with the organization. So there's a narrative component, any related documents to those strategic conversations we're going to have. So we're just talking about those 2 big conversations we're going to have, the finance conversation we're going to have. So for any related or supporting documents, right? If we're going to talk about how we're doing against our strategic plan, put the strat plan in the board packet. Don't make people go kind of try to look it up, right? So we want to make sure anything they're going to need to be fully engaged here is there. At the same time, our goal is not to like shock and awe, like overwhelm the board, right? So we don't need to put a 60-page board packet together. So totally fine to only put the things we really think people are going to look at and need for the conversation. And finally, for finances, we want to send these ahead of time as well so people can get a chance to look at these if at all possible. We want to include the most recent month. If we are on a quarterly meeting schedule, the most recent 2 months. So basically any financial reporting we have that's occurred since the last time we met. Typically, this is always going to include 3 things: your balance sheet, your profit and loss statement, as well as your budget year to date, right? So how we're performing against our budget so far across the fiscal year. Some organizations also look at the cash flow statement. Sometimes it's only included a few times a year. Really depends on your organization and how kind of important or variable that cash flow might be. So that's something that we see some people include sometimes. And then just a recommendation to include a cover sheet or narrative here as well. Nothing long, usually half a page or less, especially if our finances are pretty straightforward or straightforward that month. It can be pretty short and sweet. But including this because we know on most boards, it is rare that 100% of them are fully familiar with financial statements. Even if we've offered some training, probably don't feel really comfortable with it. So sometimes won't dive into a spreadsheet, won't dive into that printed P&L from our QuickBooks. So it might be helpful to have a little bit of a narrative version at the beginning, just saying like, hey, if you don't look at these statements, or even if you do, here's the 3 things that stand out to us, right, when we look at this. That can be helpful to let them know kind of where your head's at, what the big trends are, and if they are uncomfortable looking at documents, it gives them at least something to engage with during the financial conversation. And then finally, thinking about how we're involving committees in our meeting structure. So this will be our final kind of generic tip, and we'll go into some advice on the different board meeting formats moving forward. But again, if our board meeting is really meant to drive engagement, to drive kind of board member to board member conversation, peer-to-peer engagement, part of this means we need to delegate some ownership. It can't just be us making people talk to each other. We need to bake into the agenda people owning some different pieces. So a lot of those strategic conversations, for instance, right, the finance report out, any type of reporting out that happens at the meeting can often be led by a committee chair instead of us. We'll talk more about how to do that strategically a little bit later today. But making sure our committees are able to do that, right? So if we have our committees and we really want them to be able to own parts of the meeting, we have to think strategically ahead of time about how we're getting them in a place that they can do that authentically. So we're thinking about making sure our committees are meeting typically monthly, bi-monthly in some cases, but they have to be meeting frequently enough that they have something to report on at our board meeting, right? So if our board meeting is monthly, committees are probably meeting monthly. If our board meetings are quarterly, either monthly or bi-monthly, but we want to make sure, again, committees are doing stuff in between meetings that they then can talk about at the meetings. This is going to force some focus on the committee part, and again, generate some content and progress for them to share when we all get together. Some of the things that we see committees do that they then can report on. Exec might be reporting on some board structure or engagement issues, right? If we're having any type of conversations about how the board itself is doing, exec is often the committee that's going to do that. Governance might be talking about recruitment or new bylaws, right? Things like that. Finance, obviously owning the finance conversation. Development, often owning the conversation around events, or if there's a fundraising update or fundraising conversation to have. And then any ad hoc committees often will have reports to give back, given the fact that they're doing something really focused over a smaller amount of time. And then while having the chair kind of lead that section of the meeting, right? So if we're having the finance chair lead the financial report out, making sure others on the committee are informed that's going to happen so they can fully engage in the conversation as much as possible.
Matt?
Yes.
You're frozen on our screen. We can still hear your audio, but we see your mouse moving, but your video is frozen.
Got it. Sorry about that. Let me reconnect real fast, see if that helps.
Okay.
All right, great. Sorry about that. Hopefully, at least the audio continues, and hopefully the video comes back here in just a second. So the final kind of generic tip here, we see organizations thinking about this moving forward, is trying to decide what are board meetings going to look like long term now, right? And granted, originally this was kind of post COVID. We know we are still in that to some extent. So we may not be quite facing this choice yet. We might still be virtual right now. But at some point, we're going to decide, are board meetings going to remain virtual, go back to in-person all the time, or some type of hybrid option in the middle? We see a lot of organizations debating this. Some have already decided virtual has been great. We have better attendance than ever, right? We're going to keep doing this forever. Others are desperate to return in person or already have. And some are, and probably the majority, are undecided. So breaking down our kind of three big options here, then we'll give some tips for each of these depending on which one we go with moving forward. And also just know moving forward, if you go with one of these and it's not working out well, you can always change, right? So this isn't a permanent decision by any means. So when thinking about the meeting format, the first bucket, right, so kind of staying virtual, some of the things that hopefully people have found or will find after some of the tips we share about virtual meetings, they are the most accessible, right? People can join them from wherever they are. Board members can be on vacation and still join, right? They could be working late, still join. So we often have seen nonprofits reporting that their best attendance ever has been during this past year, actually, with board meetings being virtual. People are able to show up more often than typical, and that really has driven some engagement there. There's some different virtual tools we'll talk about here in just a second that can really drive engagement. And those tools don't really exist in person as much. So that's been helpful for people to be able to use. It allows for more geographic diversity. So if we're a regional organization, right, or a statewide organization, or just work over a large local area even, we can have board members that have a 45, 50-minute commute to get to our meeting join virtually, right? And that maybe expands who we can consider to be on the board. And obviously right now in the moment, both the safest, but also just the simplest option, right? We don't have to worry about masking. We don't have to worry about finding a space big enough or doing a meeting outside or something. Just doing it virtual, then it doesn't really matter what type of rules are kind of getting placed or how people are feeling about it. Some of the downsides of going virtual. It is difficult to engage new board members doing this, right? So we do know for new board members, this can be a challenge for them to kind of feel engaged if they still haven't met folks. We know that we've talked to some board members who joined a year ago who still haven't met any other board members in person, right? Or haven't met the executive director in person. And that's a real challenge, right? To keep people engaged when there's not necessarily that in-person relational element. So that is something to think about if we're staying virtual. Relationship building in general. So we do see that typically speaking, Zoom can be really helpful for maintaining relationships that already exist, but can actually be difficult to build new relationships. But even for those maintenance ones, it's not the same, obviously, as being in person with people in the room. So we know that that's a limitation of it long term. And then finally, right now, we don't expect this to be an issue long term, but right now, for instance, there's a fair amount of Zoom fatigue, right? People are tired of looking at screens, being on screens, and that might be impacting the level of engagement we're getting during virtual meetings. If we're thinking about the in-person bucket, right, some of the pros here obviously kind of almost flipped from virtual. Best for relationship building, right? Really easy to engage new board members in the fold, right? Have a social, get them connected to people. We know in general there's less multitasking, right? A lot of folks are on Zoom and also on email, right? Doing something else, writing something down. So in person drives a little bit more focus at times, or at least limits the distractions, I should say. And obviously for us as a facilitator, board chair, ED, whatever, it's easier to read or engage people, right? It's just simpler for us to have a sense of engagement. when people are in the room versus just kind of looking at them on a screen. Some of the downsides of in-person, obviously, kind of again, flip from virtual, it's less accessible, right? We typically have more attendance issues. If people are on vacation or have a long drive or work late, right, we might lose them. People show up late, it makes it hard to start the meeting on time. And those issues are less prevalent in the virtual space. Cost and time in the space itself, if we don't have an office room big enough to host the board at our offices, we either have to find something pro bono given to us or spend money on that, and that's a resource we have to give. And then sometimes if we have, for instance, a board that one or two people really dominate the conversation, going back in person, we've seen those groups kind of fall right back in those patterns, right? Whereas virtual, it may have been a little bit more egalitarian. We actually maybe had more universal participation there. So something to think about. For hybrid, there are two ways people are thinking about doing hybrid. We're going to talk about one of those ways today. So one way people are thinking about doing a hybrid that we'll talk about today is that some meetings will be in person, some meetings will be virtual moving forward, right? The other way to think about hybrid is obviously for any one meeting, there's an in-person and virtual component. That's something we're not advising folks to go forward with. We understand some folks will, and that might make sense for them. And definitely, a board is a small group of people. So maybe for those 10 or 12 people, it really works well. But typically speaking, we see hybrid meetings where some people are in person, some people are virtual, just really hard to have equal participation. Obviously, inherently, we can't have any type of small groups that are, intermingled between virtual and person. It's easy to talk over each other. One group usually feels a little bit more left out than the other. People are wondering, well, why did I come in person if they joined virtually? So we typically don't recommend the hybrid meeting for one meeting itself, but we do see a lot of organizations considering this hybrid schedule, which makes a lot more sense, right, in some ways. So this again would be some in-person meetings, some virtual meetings across the year. Pros for this, it allows at least some time across the year for relationship building, right? It's not as much as always being in person, but at least some. It's going to increase that level of accessibility. So if someone does struggle to come in person, they still can come to at least some or most of the meetings throughout the year. And it may drive focus a little bit. We're only beginning to see people use this type of plan, but it does allow people to know, like, when we're in person, it's because we have big conversations we need to have. When we're virtual, we know how to do that. We've been doing it. Allows people maybe have a little bit more focus on each of those when they're there. Some of the downsides, this can be a little confusing for folks. It may also limit the focus on the virtual meetings. If we're only meeting in person for the really big conversations, it makes the virtual ones maybe feel a little less important. So we'll go through a couple tips on each one of these channels here in just a second. So for the virtual meetings that we're going to remain virtual moving forward or have virtual meetings moving forward, the first tip is make sure we're using the tools we have available, right? So being virtual, while it limits us in some ways, it also lets us do some things we can't do easily in person. So some of those, we really recommend folks are using video. Even with the Zoom fatigue we're feeling, we see that really drives engagement much more than having screens off. Using a roll call, as we mentioned earlier at the beginning of the meeting, to have people out loud unmute and say here. As silly as that sounds, gets them in the process of unmuting. And once someone unmutes once and talks, they're much more likely to continue to do so. So something to consider there. And we just want to make sure at this point, as long as we're on Zoom, it's kind of almost universal. But if we're not on Zoom or if we're using a new platform or something, we want to make sure everyone's familiar with it, right? So if we switch for any reason to something else, important we provide some training there to make sure people aren't confused as they're using it during the meeting. The second tool, and this is really one that's kind of underutilized, but we really encourage folks to consider, is using breakout rooms for the board meeting. So we see people use these at 1 or 2 times, either at the beginning of the meeting, breaking people into small groups of 3 or 4 to really kind of check in with each other for a few minutes, see how things are going, and then come back together as a full group. We know if we did that with a full group, it would take 40 minutes, right? Half an hour or something. If we had everyone give a 1-minute update, that's actually a 2-minute update. We got 13 board members. We're talking about 20, 30 minutes of our agenda, and we just don't have time for that. But if we break people into groups of 3 or 4, allow them to dive deep with each other for 4 or 5 minutes, come back, it can be an easy way to do a check-in with folks. and make them feel connected to at least some of the people at the meeting. The other time we could use this is during some of those big strategic conversations. If we're either worried about engagement or we're seeing engagement lag during those conversations, asking a couple of really pointed questions, right? What do you think about this? This is a current idea, please respond to it, etc. Put them in breakout rooms again of kind of 3 to 5 at most. Have them dive deep into a conversation or topic that we gave them, come back and tell them ahead of time one of them has to report out. That again is going to drive that small conversation. They then will share, and it makes more likely people will talk afterwards there as well. And then finally, one thing too that we can do virtually, we can also do in person, but is really important to do virtually, is getting the board their materials a week ahead of time, right? Agenda, etc., things like that, in that board packet that we already talked about, so they can have it up at the same time they're going through the meeting. You know, a lot of times people show up to a meeting, maybe they didn't print stuff out, or they did, they can't find it, you know, they're not flipping along. It's easier to do that digitally, so that can be a helpful thing as long as we get it to them ahead of time. Second tip here, prepping the conversation, right? Driving engagement virtually. If we hear one downside of virtual, other than the relationship building piece, is that sometimes the conversation feels a little shallow, or they don't know how to necessarily call people out virtually. So a couple of tips for that. Again, it's really important we're delegating parts of the meeting. So we already talked about like committee chairs owning parts of the conversation, but it's really easy to come off as monotone online, right? If I'm just talking and no one else is, that's gonna be really hard to engage people. So it's important we have multiple voices facilitating there to keep that engagement high. We wanna ask committee chairs, board chair to speak in addition to ourselves, and then obviously try to drive conversation from the board members. The more committee chairs though, or the more kind of board members are talking, the more likely is the rest join in, right? They may not always be encouraged to speak by us as the ED or by us as the board chair, but if other board members, even if their committee chair speaks, it makes it feel more like, oh, we all should be participating. We want to make sure, again, that board packet is used to inform people ahead of time. One reason sometimes people don't participate is because they don't feel like they have enough grasp or understanding of the topic or confidence in it. Not everyone's going to read that packet, so it is important if we start one of these strategic conversations to start with, you know, 2 to 5 minutes of kind of background info, right? If you didn't get a chance to read, here's the high level stuff you need to know, because that's really important that we make sure that everyone feels like they're at least some level of equal footing to be able to participate in the conversation. And then finally, if no one's talking, right, if we want some different opinions that aren't definitely speaking up, there's kind of 2 options here. One is obviously breakout rooms we already talked about, but 2 is we can definitely call out folks online. But it's really important here, as it is in person, which we'll talk about in a second, that we're using that format of like, you know, like, hey, you know, with your marketing expertise, right, I'd be really curious to hear what you think about this plan right now, right? Or you've been on the board during our last 2 strategic planning cycles. I'd love to hear what you think about our next one. You know, like whatever it is, experience or expertise based, leading with a kind of, hey, because of this, I think you might have a valuable thing to say. Still might make some people feel called out. They may still not totally appreciate it, but gives you a lot of cover, right? Sounds good and engaging to the board. It makes that person at least have a little bit of a sense of why you're asking them to participate right there. And finally, just keeping video on. Again, throughout the meeting, we see that really drives engagement. Couple tips if we're going back in person instead that are specific to being in person. One of the best things about being in person is the relationship building, so we want to lean into that. We want to make sure we're starting the meeting by checking in with folks, hearing from everyone. It can be a very quick update, a very quick question that we're asking everyone to respond to, but we want to set that tone of participation early on. It also gives us a little bit of a sense of how things are going with folks, a little bit of interaction. Again, it's not going to solve everything right on our engagement, but it's going to make people feel a little more connected to each other. We also want to think about before or after the meeting having a separate social time, right? So obviously this is optional. Some people don't have time, right? Got kids they got to get back to, etc. But before or after the meeting, just setting up a little bit of space so people can come, network, talk with each other, catch up, right? Some of these board members have been serving together for years, right? They're friends now. So we want to make sure that space is available for both new and older board members to connect with each other. And then finally, if we are back in person and thinking about in-person things, thinking about, is there an independent time outside of a board meeting that we can also use to drive this kind of social connection, right? So it could be, just a dinner at the chair's house, right? It could be that we book a happy hour spot. It could be that we meet at the office, whatever it is, but some type of opportunity to connect with each other outside of a typical board meeting, often encouraging them to bring family or partners, and a chance again to get to know each other as people, just as we would with a donor. This type of personal engagement is really important. Our second kind of in-person tip here, again, for creating dialogue and participation, but this time in person, similar to virtual in a lot of ways, but a few slight different tweaks on it. So we still want to use small groups here. So we obviously can't do breakout rooms, but we want to replicate that a little bit in person. So dividing people again into groups of 3 or 5, and having them either do some problem solving, or again, if the conversation is lagging, having them kind of talk about something in a small group and then sharing out can be really helpful. Asking them to choose someone that's going to report back ahead of time, right? So that they're prepared to answer any of those questions. And typically for in-person, we want to give 5 or 10 minutes. It can quickly feel like a long time. So those 5 or 10 minutes helps kind of scope that for them, enough time for them to dive into it, but not so long that they feel disconnected from the group. If we are going to call out, very similar to virtual, we want to use that kind of technique where we're leading with experience or expertise, but we do want to make sure, especially in person, it's done in a non-confrontational way. So it makes it even more important we're thinking about how we're saying that there, so it doesn't kind of shift the tone of the meeting. And we can do this virtually as well, but in person, it's often important. We're prepping some people ahead of time to participate. Sometimes there's a little greater fear of that in-person participation. So I want to make sure people know ahead of time, hey, I might ask you to participate in this way, right? Or offer your opinion on this thing. And finally, the last tip we'll have here, then we'll pause for questions, is if we are going to go hybrid, right? Some in person, some virtual meetings. The biggest thing is that we're thinking about the schedule of the year ahead of time, right? We don't want to be making these decisions ad hoc for every single meeting. We want to think about for the next 12 months, which ones do I want to do in person, which ones do I want to do virtually. If we are going to do some of these in person, we want to do at least 2. So if we meet quarterly, 2/half of our meetings would be in person, 2 would be virtual. If we meet monthly, still at least 2, and probably more like 3 or 4. We want to make sure this isn't so rare that people are surprised when we get together in person, but we also want to make sure that it's somewhat equally balanced, even if slightly more virtual if we're meeting more frequently. Some of the big strategic things like a budget conversation or a 6-month review or stuff like that is probably best suited for in-person, where we can really have that dialogue easily back and forth there. So trying to plan in-person meetings around those kind of big conversations, and making sure that people know the why, right? It is harder to get to, have to get a sitter, right? They have to drive in traffic, etc. So it's important people understand the why for scheduling an in-person meeting. Committees are going to become even more important here as people are kind of in person sometimes, virtual sometimes. Committees will be the constant that drives work forward. So I want to make sure that those are still meeting regularly so people feel like there's some consistency of something, even as the other meetings kind of change or shift. And then finally, it's really important that even though the in-person meetings are going to be reserved for some of those biggest strategic conversations, that they both feel important, right? We want to make sure that neither type of meeting feels less valuable than the other. These are just a few next steps kind of moving forward to kind of update and kind of revamp your meeting agenda. But I want to go ahead and pause here and take the last 10 minutes for any questions that you all have.
Okay, thanks, Matt. We do have some questions that have come in. Those of you in attendance, if anything comes to mind, please send them my way. But we'll get started here. We've considered purchasing a board management software or dashboard. There are clearly pros and cons. A big one is the expense. Do you have any thoughts on these, and/or do you know of any that are low cost or no cost options?
Yeah, so we typically work with organizations that are small enough, kind of $4 million budget or less, that type of software usually is cost prohibitive too. Or at least not the kind of first thing they would spend their money on. So we often advise folks just using Excel or even Canva for part of this, a design software that's free and available to make like a simple dashboard can be really helpful. In Excel, a lot of things we might be tracking is board member attendance, right? Board member fundraising participation, but designing those can get DIY. And there's some good templates online too. If you Google that, can be really helpful and usually is enough to get people started, at least initially.
Mm-hmm. And I'll just add in, we've had some DCMP members that have used something like a Google site or Dropbox if they just really want something basic, no cost, and a place to kind of park documents and create shared folders. It's not going to give you that dashboard feature, but they have seen some success with that as just being a single place where people can log in and access files. Okay, the next question here is, we noticed that Zoom meetings are really efficient and we can cover a lot of ground in a shorter amount of time, which is something our board appreciates. How can we capture this efficiency in our in-person meetings?
Yeah, I think one of the big things there for those in-person meetings is going to be making sure people are prepped ahead of time, right, as much as possible. I think we sometimes saw, in all reality, people use those 30 minutes before, I'd like to think if I send a board packet a week ahead of time, people are poring over it for a week, but reality wise, right, they're really reading it the 30 minutes before the meeting. The reason they're not doing that in person is because they're driving to your office, right? So it's really important we're thinking about for those meetings, how we're driving a culture where people are coming to the meeting having read the stuff, because we actually have seen that increase lately because people are doing it in the minutes leading up to the meeting instead of commuting. That's the biggest, I think, difference we've seen that causes a little bit of that efficiency in person.
This person says, we're an all volunteer organization and our board meetings are pretty, quote, loose. Our culture is less formal, but it would be nice to have more focus in board meetings. We use an agenda, but beyond that, what baby steps would you recommend that we implement?
Yeah, so I think this can be another great time to really focus on that delegation piece, right? So it's not just one person talking. So as we're giving ownership to other people, right, they're having to prep some conversations. As we're giving an agenda out that has times on it, that's one thing we recommend as well. A lot of times we'll give an agenda and it doesn't have times on it. If we give an agenda and say, hey, we're going to talk about this for 20 minutes, that's going to be a little bit of a signal to people that we're either going to talk about it more than they might expect or less. But again, gives them a little bit of sense of weight. So I would definitely delegate to some folks, so it's not just you leading it, so people feel kind of a level of responsibility there, and then put those times on there as a signal for people to understand kind of where we're going to spend our time together.
Okay, just a couple more questions left, and this one actually dovetails with the suggestion you just made. Our subcommittee chairs do the bulk of the reporting at meetings, so part of the agenda is being delegated to board members. This is great for engagement and participation, but we struggle with actual strategic discussion in full board meetings. People seem more comfortable having those conversations at the subcommittee level, but we need them in our full board meetings. How do we get there?
Yeah, so this is why we've become really strong advocates of those breakout rooms virtually or small groups when we're back in person. We see again, you can imagine virtually on the screen, right? If there's 15 people on your board, right? Or even 10 or 12 people, or in person, if there's not a really strong personal relationship between some of the board members, that can be an intimidating experience for folks, something they don't necessarily do in their day job on a regular basis, right? Talk in front of 14 people with my opinion on something. But breaking those groups down to 3 or 5, giving them some time to process, talk, have one of them report out, at least ensures everyone's opinions getting heard there a little bit. And then also is going to be more likely to drive some engagement, because that's the one thing we've seen that I think supports that a bit.
Okay, final question. We have a board education agenda item where we do a deeper dive on a given topic or program or new opportunity, policy, etc. This is met with varying degrees of interest and engagement. The topic being covered is a big part of that. But do you have any thoughts or reactions about including this as a standing agenda item?
Yeah, so I think that can totally make sense. I think it depends on the goal of it, right? So a lot of times if we're talking about diving deep into a program, right, that we're doing, it's really because we want to interest the board in it, right? And we're using it as kind of that mission moment that we talked about. If we want to go deeper into some board education around either fundraising or finance, it's usually more like board member education, so they can more fully participate in our financial conversations moving forward or our fundraising conversations moving forward. And if it's a deeper dive into a policy we're recommending, that I think would be kind of a third purpose of like, hey, we might be voting on this soon, or this is technically part of being a board member you might not know about. We want to make sure you do. So I think all three of those can be valuable, but I think making sure it's probably clear to the board which of those you're doing at any time is going to be most helpful. If, hey, we're trying to talk about programming, so we want to remind you how great this organization is, or we're trying to give you some skills so you can more fully participate because we care about your opinion, or this is part of being a board member and we want to kind of talk about it to make sure everyone's aware. So definitely I think could be on the agenda, but I just want to be clear about the purpose there.
That was our last question, Matt. Is there anything that you'd like to say as you kind of wrap up the entire series?
Yeah, I just think we know from a lot of board members and staff, sometimes board engagement, boards in general, right, can be a stressful topic. And it's rare we talk to anyone that there's like, my board's absolutely perfect. But that's because it's rare we talk to anyone that says like their staff's absolutely perfect, right? Or anything's absolutely perfect. So just really aligning expectations on board and staff. We've seen organizations grow tremendously when they get that board engaged and the right people in seat. So always having that kind of progressive mindset with your board, right? Like regardless of what's happened, what little thing can we do next that's going to make engagement a bit stronger with our meetings, our recruitment, et cetera, is what we always advise. And we've seen some great progress on that. So excited to hopefully have offered some information that can help there.
Well, you certainly have, and I think it's important for everybody to keep in mind that people get involved in boards for a variety of different reasons, and you've touched on that in the other parts of the webinar series. But try to meet them where they are, try to engage them in different ways, and remember that when you try something, it doesn't have to be forever. So some of these things that it can feel like, oh, we're making a big change, or is this going to go over well? If it doesn't, you have the flexibility to change that and try new things and engage people in different ways. So I would say don't be hesitant to give that a try and see what works for your organization, because that's what's most important. Matt, you've been incredible across this entire series, so I just want to sincerely thank you for your time and the effort that went into developing this, and for your willingness to share with our members. Really appreciate your partnership and everything that you brought to this series, so thank you.
Yeah, definitely. No, thank you all for having me. Really appreciate it.
Okay, big thanks to everybody who attended today as well. As we mentioned earlier, we'll send a follow-up evaluation link to you. We ask that you please take a minute to complete that and share your feedback. We have a lot coming up this fall for DCMP members. We're currently accepting applications for our social media once-over opportunity, where DCMP members can sign up to have their Facebook presence evaluated by NIU honors students who will provide structured feedback and ideas for improvement. That's on our website right now. The Community Foundation is accepting applications for the Community Needs Grant Program and the Wurlitzer Foundation Fund Grant Program. Both have a deadline of September 1st. And we hope that you'll join us for Nonprofit Day on September 22nd at the Egyptian Theater. Our theme is Leading with Joy, which is a topic, conversation about positivity and optimism, given everything that we all have been through over the last year and a half or so. That was a topic that our program committee felt strongly about, and we have a fantastic keynote speaker to deliver that message. So a lot coming up. That Nonprofit Day event is included in your DCMP membership, so hope you'll join us for that. You can learn about all of these and more by visiting dcmp.org. Once again, thank you for attending, and we also thank Matt Gayer for sharing his time and expertise with all of us. Thank you. Take care.